What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Sports Medicine Broadcast, Airway Management and Sports Medicine Concepts. We've got Mike Cendoma Skyping in with us, and we've also got Kathy. See, we didn't practice it. She said Tupac, but with an S, right? So, Supac.
Shupak.
See, why can't I remember? See, all right. So you got Kathy Shupak here. Kathy actually recommended I talk to Mike. She said she was fascinated with the presentation they did at SWATA, and this is a very good idea because actually before Kathy kind of brought it up to us, it was never important to me to practice with the FMS extractor or the FM extractor or practice using or think about area management stuff. It was just kind of like, well, we have EMS at the varsity football games, but what about everything else? All right. And so Mike's going to talk about sports medicine concepts, some of the tools that he's developed there, and specifically airway management and what we as athletic trainers need to think about. So I am the host, Jeremy Jackson. This conversation is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/airway management. And since Mike is going to be sharing some YouTube videos, I've also created a link to the YouTube of this. So it's a little bit easier to access, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/Mike Cendoma, which is CENDOMA. So you can go to Airway Management and they'll have the links there, or you can go to sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/Mike Cendoma, and that'll be to the YouTube. So you can see the videos that he has and links that he has also. So without much further ado, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you thinking enough of the programming that we do to have us on today. I appreciate that.
Sure thing. It is always a good thing to learn beforehand rather than after an emergency situation. So, Mike, why don't you start off by telling us your athletic trainer story? What got you to where you are right now?
Well, the In 2 Minutes or Less program in Sports Medicine Concepts actually was an absolute mistake. I had no intentions whatsoever of going down this road. And if you had asked me 25 years ago what I thought I would be doing as an athletic trainer, it didn't reflect this at all. Very early on in my career, actually within 2 weeks of my first job, we had an accident happen on the football field with an opposing team member, and it was handled very, very inefficiently, myself included. The whole process was handled very poorly from the time of impact all the way through when he was transported to the hospital. And I distinctly remember that day looking down into the face mask of an athlete who was telling me that they can't feel their upper extremities and who is losing consciousness, eyes rolling back in their head. And it haunts me to this day that his thought as he was losing consciousness was, more than likely, these individuals that are on the field that are supposed to be taking care of me are arguing about what should be done with me. Meanwhile, I'm laying here, my sight is going fuzzy, I'm about to lose consciousness, I can't feel anything in my upper extremities, and then he passes out. And that haunts me to this day, that I was involved in a situation like that. Thankfully, the athlete ended up being okay. It was a spinal cord contusion, which he fully recovered from. But from that day forward, I decided that was never going to happen to me again. And that should never happen. As athletic trainers, we're out on the field to make sure that kind of stuff doesn't happen. That's what our profession is all about. That's what we proclaim our profession is all about. So for that kind of stuff to be happening, I couldn't take that, that could possibly be happening. So I just went out on a quest, if you will, to learn as much as I could about this process, educate others about the process, and this sports medicine concepts in 2 minutes or less thing unfolded from there, kind of in front of me, without a whole lot of premonition on my part. So that's kind of how I got to where I am today. The airway management stuff is just a component of overall emergency action planning and being ready for those types of events when they happen.
All right, very good. So before all of that, tell me about how you got to your first job as an athletic trainer.
I was at the University of Buffalo. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Buffalo. At the time, they didn't have an athletic training program. So I did a lot of cross studies at Canisius College, which was just down the road, from the University of Buffalo, and I kind of put my program together. That was back in the good old days when you could do it through the internship route. So I kind of put my classes together, got my, gosh, it's been a while now. I believe it was, I want to say, was it 1,500 hours that you had to get through the internship?
Yep.
Yeah, so I put my 1,500 hours together, and got everything I needed, became certified, went on to graduate school, got a graduate degree from Ithaca College in exercise physiology. And I had some really good contacts back at the University of Buffalo, where I went to undergrad school, and was lucky enough to have a job waiting for me when I got back in the outreach program, where I was a high school athletic trainer, just in a high school that was pretty much right at the border of the University of Buffalo campus. So I was very lucky in that respect. And I've been an athletic trainer. I was an athletic trainer there for a number of years. I moved out west, spent some time out in Montana while my wife was going to pharmacy school. I was a athletic trainer at a local high school there for a number of years before I moved back east. And primarily, I do work pretty consistently with the local high school here in south of Rochester, New York. But primarily my job is the program director at Sports Medicine Concepts. But I do very much enjoy my time at the high school. I think it serves twofold. I live a block and a half from the stadium. And when those lights are blaring on Friday nights and I know there's a game going on with lacrosse, football, or I see the traffic going up and down the school because I know there's a basketball going, I can't help but want to be there. So it serves that purpose for me. Serves a purpose of allowing me to keep my hands in the field. I think if you're going to teach these kinds of things, you need to be practicing these types of things on a daily basis. You can't teach people if you're not doing it. So the ability to still work in the high school is great for me. But I spend a lot of my time in curriculum development and teaching the In 2 Minutes or Less program.
All right, very good. It's interesting how you said it happened by mistake, but I think it would be more appropriate to say it happened by accident or just kind of like fell into your lap, because I certainly don't think it was a mistake that you realized there needed to be a change and you began making that change. I don't think that was a mistake. So talk to me a little bit more about In 2 Minutes or Less, and then we'll continue talking about Airway management.
Well, the In 2 Minutes or Less program came about again as I was looking into emergency response and how to care it. It actually, the In 2 Minutes or Less curriculum evolved out of the initial program, which was simply management of neurological injuries in athletics, primarily spinal cord injuries, and the proper management of equipment in that process. As that curriculum became formalized, we branched out into all neurological injuries, including head trauma. And then from there, it just branched out even further to why are we limiting these practices or these educational opportunities to neurological injuries? Why are we not addressing all emergencies that happen in athletics? Because there's a lot of crossover in terms of the preparedness for that, as well as being able to respond to those types of situations. So the In 2 Minutes or Less program kind of developed that way as far as the curriculum goes. The title, I think, is pretty interesting, how we came up with the title for the program, because if you look at the need to be prepared to respond to emergencies in terms of the chain of survival from the American Heart Association, a lot of what the American Heart Association and what we know about surviving emergencies, cardiac emergencies, and those types of things outside of athletics, just in general, we know that we have a certain time frame that is kind of defined by the chain of survival. And for the most part, we know that certain critical care tasks have to be done within 4 minutes if we want to have a significant chance of surviving that incident. Our approach is that 4 minutes is fine for the layperson that is responding to someone who falls in a parking lot and is not generally prepared for emergency response. But as athletic trainers, we have a couple of things that are really, really at our benefit. If, as an athletic trainer, if there's going to be some sort of a catastrophic incident, we have the luxury of knowing when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, and primarily who it's going to happen to. It's going to happen on the basketball court that we're covering, on the football field, 100 yards. We know where it's going to happen. And there are 52 athletes on the side of a football game, or maybe 12 on the bench at a basketball game. So we have the luxury of knowing who it's going to happen to. So with that in mind, if we're prepared to respond, if all of our emergency stuff is on the sideline and we're ready to go, there's no reason it should take us 4 minutes. We should be prepared. And so our course, our training emphasizes being able to do that in 2 minutes, with the idea that the chain of survival says we should be able to do it in 4. We're better prepared than the lay rescuer. And the additional benefit is, if we can train to do all that stuff in 2 minutes, then that gives us 2 minutes of luxury time, if you will, to deal with all the other stuff we can't plan for. The things that get thrown in our lap that we can't necessarily train for. The parents that come out of the stands and disrupt things, complications that we weren't aware of, things that go wrong on the field, which they do no matter how much we train for. That gives us 2 minutes to deal with all that stuff, and we still fall well within the 4 minutes of the chain of survival.
Kathy, what drew you to ask me to speak with Mike to bring him on the podcast?
Well, there's 2 things. One, the first time I heard Mike speak, which is, if you have not had the opportunity, if Mike is presenting at a conference you're going to, don't miss his 2 minutes or less in airway management. In the mid-'90s, I was part of a similar situation that you had, Mike, where we had an athlete with a catastrophic cervical injury, and we didn't have the proper tools. And we were fortunate because the Life Flight, which is the air ambulance in the Houston area, was refueling less than 4 miles away because our athletes stopped breathing as well. And from that moment on, there's got to be a better way. At that point, there wasn't the FM extractor. You hadn't invented it yet, or whoever had not invented it. And, I kept searching, thinking I never want to be in that situation as well. And, various tools came out and various talks. But when I saw you for the first time, I thought, there's the answer. And when I came into the school district through Houston Methodist, I knew that we could do things better. And with the help of our athletic director, and I have to give him a shout out, Rupert Hasso, I took the information from seeing you again this past summer, and we were able to, through his help, got FM extractors at every one of our high schools, at our stadium, and put together airway management kits so that we are able to handle, and we practiced. We had an in-service where we practiced using them on the helmets from each of the schools. And I appreciate your leadership and having the vision to do this. So that's what drew me to having you on this program, so that, with Jeremy's vast reach through his podcast, other people who may have had a situation that I was in or that you were in would go, well, here's what we can do to make it better. Because as athletic trainers, we're always looking for that answer, So thank you. I appreciate it.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope most are doing that. Absolutely.
Right. All right. So, Mike, let's go ahead and define airway management, and then we'll continue working from there off of that definition as we continue to understand what we as athletic trainers need to know. Okay.
As far as athletic trainers are concerned, if you want to define airway management, I would say having a process in place, having protocols in place, and having the proper equipment in place to make sure that at any given time, alone, as athletic trainers alone, without EMS, we can establish and maintain a patent airway, which we can pass oxygen through in the event that we need to do high quality CPR or rescue breathing. And that should be planned for independent of EMS. Because if you think about things for a minute, EMS, generally speaking, if we're lucky, Kathy, you were lucky because the Life Flight was refueling in the area. Had that not been the case, maybe a different outcome.
Absolutely.
Because on a good day, and this is not a criticism of EMS by any stretch, on a good day, you're lucky if EMS arrives in 6 to 8 minutes. 6 to 8 minutes of an athlete suffering an injury that results in a non-patent airway and they're not breathing, I don't need to tell everybody what the outcome of that is. And to rely on CPR masks, that's been proven significantly less effective than bag ventilation. Bag ventilation being certainly within the realm of an athletic trainer's abilities and practice act. So to rely on what I might say is archaic techniques and approaches to airway management is just not acceptable. If you're relying on EMS to provide that, which I fully understand, I did the same thing prior to some accidents happening in my professional practice or career. But to rely on EMS when you know that if you're lucky, 6 to 8 minutes, that's obviously well outside of the 4 minutes that's allotted for by the chain of survival. So, airway management, again, is, as far as athletic trainers are concerned, should be a process, a protocol, and an approach that you have the skill sets and you have the equipment right on the sideline that allows you to establish and maintain a patent airway prior to the arrival of EMS.
So I was just taking notes here so I can get it all down. All right. So how many of these trainings, how many people have you been able to educate on airway management up to this point?
I don't even know if I could give you that number. That would take a little bit of going back through some records. Suffice it to say, a lot. We've been doing this program. The initial program was first launched in 1998. That's when we did the very first, what I would say is the formal program. I've been teaching the program 3 years prior to that, starting in 1995. But it was in 1998 when we formalized sports medicine concepts, and the program became approved to offer continuing education. So since then, we've been training since 1998 officially as an approved provider. And we teach the course just dozens and dozens of times throughout the year since then. So it's a lot of people, and it's across multidiscipline. It's not just athletic trainers, but some of our professional curriculums will train athletic trainers, trauma physicians, neuro consultants, airway management physicians, paramedics, and EMS as part of a multidiscipline medical team. So it's across the spectrum, and there's a lot of people that we've provided training for.
Okay. If an athletic trainer was to walk away from this podcast right now, what would be the one thing you wanted them to hear or to know about airway management?
I want to. This is the way I always frame it to people that are in our class. I want to know, when I look across, my objective in teaching, our objectives as instructors is very simple. We want to know that if we show up as practicing athletic trainers, which we all are at Sports Medicine Concepts, my objective is that when I step out onto the field and I go over to introduce myself to you to conduct a medical timeout prior to the start of an athletic event, I want to know that you are just as prepared on your sideline as I am on mine. And if that's airway management, if we're talking airway management, then I want to know that you and I together are ultimately prepared to make sure that we can establish that patent airway through the use of BLS airway adjuncts. And we can actually provide a very high level of airway management together and perform high quality CPR prior to the arrival of EMS. That is the ultimate objective. And if anybody walks away from this podcast with anything, it should be that if I'm not already there, I need to leave and automatically put that airway management kit together, so that the very next day, if you have a basketball game tonight, if you have a hockey game tonight, then what you do when you leave this podcast is you go get your airway management stuff together and don't spend another day covering an athletic event without that preparedness in hand. That's what I would hope people would leave today with. Could
you briefly go over what should be in your airway management kit?
Yeah, it's unbelievably and ridiculously easy to provide a very high level of airway management for athletic trainers. In fact, if I might digress just a little bit, it's interesting what we've learned in teaching airway management stuff to multidiscipline groups, and that includes paramedics and airway management physicians. It's very, very interesting that if you and I, as athletic trainers, can establish and maintain a patent airway prior to the arrival of EMS using BLS airway adjuncts, OPAs and NPAs, and bag ventilation, if we are able to establish an airway and we are able to ventilate an athlete using that, airway management physicians and paramedics won't do anything different when they arrive on scene. So it's only those really strange outliers where we can't maintain a patent airway, where someone might have to be intubated or might require RSI or rapid sequence intubation. It's only those really extreme outliers that would really cause ALS or emergency management airway physicians to do anything different. If they were to show up on scene and we were passing oxygen with an OPA and a bag valve, they would just have us continue to do the same thing. So imagine that. I mean, that's with this very basic and inexpensive materials or equipment, we can provide the same level of, I like to say, advanced life support. We can actually provide 95% of ALS airway management just by having that. And so those things would include an OPA kit that has a series of various sizes so that we can size them appropriately for any athlete. I always like to have the backup NPA, or the nasopharyngeal airways, because there are times when one of those two will be contraindicated. So it's nice to have that backup. Certainly your kit should have a bag ventilator and not a CPR mask. I'm sorry, CPR masks are not our standard of care provided by athletic trainers. It's been well established that bag ventilation is much better than a CPR mask, and especially two-person bag ventilation. We should be prepared to do that. And finally, a handheld suction unit, because as we know, when we're passing oxygen back and forth, it's not necessarily vomiting that we're concerned about. But as you're pushing air into the body, when the air comes back out of the body, it's going to bring stuff back up with it. It's not necessarily vomit, but a handheld suction unit allows us to very easily clean out around that airway adjunct and maintain that airway without having to move the athlete. So those very, at the most, the handheld suction unit might run you $75. The NPAs, for some reason, they're little rubber tubes, but for some reason they're fairly expensive. They might run you anywhere from $25 to $30 for a kit of those. And the OPAs, you can buy an entire array of OPAs for $10. So you're looking at less than $100 to have what I would refer to as advanced life support airway management on your sideline.
So if somebody has not had the opportunity to take your class, and they may not feel comfortable buying these supplies, where could they seek training to use these supplies if the need arose, if they put a kit together? And second of all, would there be any concerns with practice acts, because the states that do have a practice act for athletic trainers, to make sure that they are practicing within their athletic training act?
That's always a good question, and one that comes up very frequently. But if you look at the educational curriculum for athletic trainers now, all of those things that I just mentioned as being part of your preparedness kit, if you will, on the sideline, are all well within our practice act. So you can go back and check your state practice act. It's always a good idea to do that. But if you look at the curriculum for the athletic training education programs that are being delivered now, that students are now going through, all well within what the educational requirements are, all well within what is expected of us as athletic training professionals now. The big question actually is how much emphasis are those education programs putting on the actual skill sets to use those? So that's a question. You might have to go out and update your skills to make sure you know how to use those. As far as where to get training, that's a great question. I know our 2 Minutes or Less program provides that, but other than that, even when you take your CPR class, I'm not sure, my CPR class never addresses those airway adjuncts, but they are within our practice act, and they are so easy to use that I can't imagine you would have any trouble. I was going to say you could actually go out on YouTube, I'm sure, and search all that, but then I forgot we did all of that. So on our YouTube channel, we have instructions on how to use that, use those various things. So prior to the start of this program, I went back to our YouTube channel and I created a library for anyone that's interested, and I put all those Airway adjunct videos into one library that you could watch, and that would very easily provide you just an update, if you will, of how those things are used. But as far as questions regarding Practice Act and liability and all those things, remember, these are all BLS Airway adjuncts. We're not doing anything with intubation, endotracheal tubes, combi tubes, or king tube. We're not doing anything with the more sophisticated stuff.
You mentioned during your presentation at the conference that you meet with a lot of NFL teams and do this training.
Yeah.
And that one of your things that you ran into is they have so many physicians on the sidelines and so many medical personnel, from athletic trainers to airway management physicians, which I had. Would those be pulmonologists, airway management physicians, or is that somebody with a trauma background?
Most of your airway management physicians are what they refer to as AMPs, your airway management physicians. Those, by the way, if you're ever watching a game and you see a physician or a guy that looks like a physician standing on the sideline, they have a red cap on. Those are your airway management physicians. Generally in the NFL, located around the 20 or 30 yard line by design. That's where they are. And there is one at every single game, if not two, provided by the home team. So there is an airway management physician at every NFL game, and usually either another backup or one on call in the event that something happens. Surprisingly, those airway management physicians they're either trauma physicians that come from an emergency room background, or a lot of times they're anesthesiologists. Those I'd say would be the two primary medical professionals that serve in that AMP role. Mm-hmm.
As a follow-up to that question, you kind of remarked that when you met with the NFL teams, part of your job and your training was helping each one understand what their part is should an injury occur, airway management, and getting them, because they're all highly trained A-type personalities, understand their role. Could you kind of let the listeners, the viewers, understand what that's like to deal with the highest level of the medical care that goes on in the NFL?
Those programs that we do for the NFL are extremely interesting and very unique, in the sense that like you had mentioned, you have so many very, very highly skilled medical professionals across a multidiscipline group. And the thing that happens is you have to remember that they are sometimes the most highly skilled in their profession, in their region. But they're used to, anesthesiologists, for example, they're used to intubating in an emergency room or in an OR just prior to surgery. Your trauma physicians, although obviously very versed at dealing with emergencies, they're dealing with that in the trauma bay. Paramedics are very skilled at what they do, and I'm very grateful for paramedics, because when your car rolls over in a ditch at 4:30 in the morning in the snow, that probably won't happen to you out there, but it happens a lot back here in New York State. But your paramedics they not only can they apply those skill sets, but they can do it in the most adverse conditions. But adverse conditions and conditions similar to OR and trauma bays are different than in the middle of an NFL stadium where 80,000 people are watching what you're doing, plus how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, are watching on TV. So it's interesting because now you have very highly skilled individuals that may get extremely nervous when they have to perform those skill sets in front of such a huge audience. So that's one component of it. The other component, Kathy, is exactly what you said, is that most of these guys that come together are used to being the chief. And now all of a sudden you have all of these chiefs that are the chief of their independent areas back Monday through Saturday. But now Sunday, they all come to the stadium. And now you have 25 chiefs on the sideline. So what our job is what we do is we come in, we don't teach them how to do it. We're not even thinking that we could teach them how to do anything that they know how to do. What we simply do is teach them how to choreograph the skill sets that they all bring, so that the paramedic may think that he's in charge of intubation. The airway management physician may think that he's in charge of intubation. So that obviously can present a problem if both people are trying to intubate the athlete and no one is caring for other critical care tasks that need to be taken care of. So our job is to help them choreograph that into an efficient emergency action plan, help them practice that. So when 80,000 people are watching them, it's almost routine. It's almost just pre-programmed as far as what they do, and the noise just goes away. And we find that a lot. That's a comment we see a lot is 80,000 screaming fans in the middle of a stadium is almost deafening. But when something like this happens, the noise just goes away, and people that are highly trained can just get the work done that they have to get done.
All right. So Mike, let's take everybody through the free version, the free condensed version of In 2 Minutes Less. As we talk about airway management, just walk us through what we need to know, the steps. We've talked about what you need in your kit and some of the trainings you do at the NFL, and really how awesome this course is. And so just give us the free version, and feel free to throw in those videos, reference those, however you want to do it.
Right. Well, the first thing, obviously, that we always talk about is everything is based on cardiac, airway, breathing, maintain neurological status of the athlete. That is the case no matter what you're dealing with. It just so happens that in the overwhelming majority of cases, you go out onto the field and the athlete is yelling, screaming, rolling around. So we already know the status of what I call the cabin. I call it the cabin, CAB, neurological, and I throw the IN in there just to make a neat acronym that everybody can remember. So I call it an initial cabin check. It just so happens that you have the luxury of pretty much knowing what the cabin status is in most of the cases. If you have a face down athlete or an athlete that's not moving, you don't necessarily know what the status of your cabin is when you get out there. So we're going to use safe handling maneuvers to reposition that athlete from a face down to a face up position. We're automatically going to manipulate that. I shouldn't use that word. Manipulate is kind of a scary term. We should reposition that athlete into cervical neutral position. And right off the bat, cardiac, airway, breathing. So our initial assessment is going to be for that carotid pulse to make sure there's a pulse there. If there is a pulse, then we are going to go to we're going to check our breathing. And in athletics, I always tell everybody, forget the head tilt chin lift. It has no place in athletics, just because of the ongoing risk of a cervical injury due to trauma. We just leave the head tilt chin lift out. We use a modified jaw thrust, because if we're trained in a modified jaw thrust, we're going to be able to do that modified jaw thrust and open the airway. And the thing to keep in mind about airway management is that the cool thing in athletics is that in the overwhelming majority of cases, if an athlete is not breathing, it's probably because the tongue has fallen back over and blocked the airway. So if we do a modified jaw thrust, I always tell people, if your athlete isn't breathing, that's not the worst case scenario. Don't panic just because they're not breathing. Chances are modified jaw thrust brings the tongue back away from the airway. And if you just wait, the body is real good at knowing what it's supposed to be doing. And the brain, within 20 or 30 seconds, is going to realize it's not breathing, and it's going to start to breathe again. All right, so modified jaw thrust, open that airway. We establish the patent airway, reestablish breathing. And then hopefully, just by maintaining the modified jaw thrust, we can keep that airway patent.
All right, let me jump in 1 second. You said patent airway a couple times. I don't know what that is.
Patent airway is just an open and established airway on which we can pass oxygen through.
Okay.
A non-patent airway might be one where the tongue is fallen back over and we can't pass oxygen. If they're vomiting and we can no longer pass oxygen because the airway is being choked off by vomit, or an object is blocking the airway, that would be what we might call a non-patent airway.
All right.
One that we can't pass oxygen through and ventilate through. So what's really nice is in athletics, most of the time, our athlete passes out and the tongue falls back over the airway, closing off the airway, and that's what causes the respiratory distress. So moving that tongue back away opens the airway, allows the athlete to start breathing again, and emergency averted. If they remain unconscious, then there's obviously going to be the inherent risk that every time you drop the modified jaw thrust, the tongue falls back over, and now we have the issue of not being able to establish and maintain that patent airway. So that's going to be a condition where if they are unconscious, we're going to drop the oropharyngeal airway, or the OPA, which is very easy to do. And I don't think sharing the video would be necessarily appropriate, but I can certainly show you the screen, if you will. So here is our YouTube channel, and you can see here I've got the OPA instructional video, and it just goes through the video will go through the steps of measuring the OPA and then inserting the OPA. And it's as I said, the video is 1 minute and 15 seconds long, and that's really all there is to it. It is not a difficult process. And you can see the mannequin here, that it's just a thorax mannequin. Any one of your American Red Cross or American Heart Association agencies would have a mannequin that you would be able to use to practice these techniques on. So that would be a strong suggestion that I would make. Now, there are times when an OPA might be contraindicated. Those contraindications would be if your athlete is awake, or is semi-awake, semi-conscious, primarily if they have a gag reflex. If they are unconscious and you try and insert the OPA and they're not completely unconscious, you're going to find that out right away, so you'll know that there's a contraindication to moving forward. But if they still do need some airway help, some aid, then that's when your NPA could come into place. And our YouTube channel also has a video to help you with that as well. So here you'll see the measuring technique for an NPA and the insertion technique for an NPA. So all videos that are open and free, and hopefully will be an educational resource for you as well. Okay. Now, the only time an NPA might be contraindicated is if you have a significant head injury where you are fearful of skull fracture, especially a basilar skull fracture. Then the OPA is going to be, the NPA would be contraindicated. All right. So once you establish the airway, you see here we established an airway, and now we're bag ventilating. And again, we have the luxury in athletics that more often than not, trauma is going to result in an airway that we can handle with an OPA or an NPA. Okay. If we have other issues such as anaphylaxis that closes off the airway, we might be in a situation there, in an extreme case, where that might be a situation where the NPA can help us, but in the long term, we're going to need EMS to help us manage that situation. Okay. And then, of course, we're going to go just into our general American Heart Association, or our CPR cardiac care parameters for providing a rescue breathing. Okay. So kind of in a nutshell, what you're looking for is establishment and maintenance of an airway. If you can't do that, then you're looking at either you're making a decision between the OPA and the NPA. My strong suggestion would be to go to the OPA first, unless it's contraindicated. Contraindication for that would be if your athlete has a gag reflex. Then move on to the NPA. After that, after you've established the airway, then we're going to initiate rescue breathing using a bag valve. Doesn't necessarily have to be hooked up to oxygen. It's interesting because I have oxygen as part of my emergency kit, and always practice. When I practice, I always practice ventilating with the oxygen hooked up to the tank. 3 years ago, we had a soccer player that was hurt, and we actually had to do some of this stuff with her. And I completely forgot to hook up the oxygen to the mask. So, I mean, those are things that no matter how many times you practice, no matter how many times you go over things, things are not going to go exactly as you practice and exactly how you plan. But if you forget the oxygen, that's not the worst case scenario, because a bag valve with ambient room oxygen provides more than enough for ventilation purposes.
All right, go ahead and continue. So we've gotten the C, A, B, and then the non-existent I, but the N.
Yeah. The non-existent I is just, thrown into it so I can spell cabin. Obviously, the neurological component comes into play, and we want to make sure that we bring the athlete into cervical neutral position as soon as possible. And we certainly want to do that within the first 2 minutes of the accident. And research has shown that when we do that, we provide that athlete the best chance of walking away from that injury. Not only do we need to have them in cervical neutral position for airway management stuff, but research has shown that when we have them in neutral position, the vertebral column provides the greatest amount of space for the neurological tissue. However much anatomical space is allotted by that individual is maximized when the individual is in cervical neutral position. So we want to make sure that we do put them in cervical neutral for those two primary reasons. The question always comes up about the uneasiness of moving somebody that may or may not have a neck injury. And the literature does address that as well. And it's very clear that by moving somebody who is not in neutral position to neutral position, the benefits far outweigh the risks that might come about from moving that person. Even the trauma physicians that we talk about and the neural trauma physicians that we work with are all in line with the idea that they need to be brought into cervical neutral position, and the benefits outweigh the potential risks. And they'll even tell you that the potential risks really aren't even potential risks. They don't see those as risk factors. They see the benefit of neutral position, neutral cervical. And I always make this argument too. When EMS arrives on scene and finds an athlete that's not in cervical neutral position, what are they going to do? They're going to move them into cervical neutral position before they do anything else. So if we as athletic trainers don't move them into cervical neutral position, all we do is delay the amount of time in between the accident and when they are brought into cervical neutral. And the literature is pretty clear. We want them in cervical neutral within 2 minutes to maximize the benefit of that. So by not moving them into cervical neutral position, all we do is waste that increment of time. They're going to be put into neutral position anyway. It's just going to be outside of the time frame that we see the biggest benefit of moving them into cervical neutral. And then, of course, after we take care of all of that, our safe handling maneuvers in terms of equipment removal, all those things start to come into play at that point. And the ongoing assessment of the cabin to make sure that if you do have an airway emergency, that it doesn't follow with a cardiac arrest or a cardiac emergency. And the really important thing, one of the very important things that I think athletic trainers need to be aware in terms of airway management, we went over the importance of it from a rescue breathing standpoint. We went over it in terms of the inexpense of putting together a good emergency airway management protocol and plan. The other thing you need to keep in mind is when your athlete's not breathing for whatever reason, whether the tongue has fallen back over or not, I made the comment that it's not necessarily on its own a panic emergency situation. Because we know that if we open that and establish that airway again, chances are they're going to start to breathe on their own. The risk is if we're not prepared to do that, regardless of what is causing the respiratory distress, it will lead to cardiac arrest if we don't do it. So think of how ridiculous it would be if you had an athlete that maybe was involved in a collision, had a concussion that knocked them out, knocked them unconscious, which happens on a consistent basis, happens all the time, very frequent. And then they stop breathing. Well, they may stop breathing because they're unconscious and the tongue falls over the back of their throat. We establish and maintain an airway, and they start to breathe on their own, emergency averted. If we're not ready to do that, then within about somewhere in 2 to 4 minutes, as we're sitting there on the field, not prepared to manage that, that respiratory distress will lead to cardiac arrest. Now we're in a full high quality CPR arrangement, and now we're in a worst case scenario. If we're prepared for that event, we do a modified jaw thrust, we pop an OPA in, and chances are we don't even need to breathe for the athlete, because the reflex will kick in and they may start to breathe on their own with that OPA. If not, we bag ventilate for that athlete, emergency averted. It's very simple, it's very straightforward how we can avoid that cardiac arrest in the event. And I think that's another thing that needs to be driven home with us.
All right, so just yesterday I received my order from School Health, and it had 2 sets of the OPAs, the various sizes, they're different colors. And kind of the issue is maybe I need to just go look at your videos on YouTube, which I have a link here in the show notes to his YouTube channel, the playlist that talks about the airway management. But just using them, because there's only been one time in my life where I've ever practiced using them, and that was probably 4 years ago at University of Texas. And they said, well, here's these things you can try using, and there wasn't a whole lot of instruction, which is good because I got to just play with it. But at the same time, I'm not comfortable. And again, it was 4 years ago. You just said you practice all the time and you forgot to hook up the oxygen, right?
Yeah.
And you are the airway management guy, right? And so,
Right.
so how much more do I need to practice using these things? And so what's going to be the best way, besides watching your YouTube videos, for me to practice inserting the OPA? Because I can't really ask my student to lay there while I stick that thing in their throat, right?
Right, you can't do that. Although you can do it with the NPAs, because you can insert an NPA with someone who has a gag reflex and who is awake. So yeah, you could do it with the NPAs, but good luck finding someone that's going to let you do that. My suggestion is this: is that you crack open those OPAs, that you watch the videos, and then you practice the skill sets of inserting an OPA. Okay, but you need to practice that skill set as an overall approach. So you'll be remiss if you practice that and you get real good at inserting the OPAs on a mannequin, but you don't practice that sub skill set as part of your overall skills in performing high quality CPR, because you will forget to put the OPAs in. You'll forget that they're even in your kit. You'll forget where they are. So when I say practice your emergency action plan and practice your approach, I mean the whole thing. You practice from your stand. When we practice our emergency action plans, and when we do it in the 2 minutes or less drill, we have a step-by-step process that we go through that develops a team's emergency action plan. At the end of that, in order to pass that class, you have to pass the competencies at the end of that program. Those competencies involve, you now have your emergency action plan. You complete your medical timeout. The medical timeout is part of the checklist. If you don't complete a thorough and complete medical timeout, you can't pass the class. You can't pass that competency. We look for teams to establish where their emergency equipment is going to be located on the field. Is it behind the defensive team's bench? Is it the 50-yard line? Is it behind the scorer's table? In the gym? Where is that? And is that within reach so that you can get to that and perform these tasks appropriately? That's part of the practice scenario. Then we set up a situation where it is actually on field or on the court, and we set up a scenario, and these teams have to manage that entire scenario from start to finish. Start is with the medical timeout. Finish is where they unload them in the emergency room and they go to X-ray. So you have to practice that entire scenario over and over and over. It's very labor intensive, no doubt, but that's the only way that you won't forget the process. If you just practice subsets of the skills, you don't know, your brain can't process how it all fits together. When you practice it over and over and over again as a process, your brain just knows. It knows by psychomotor skills It just knows by memory. It knows that once I do the modified jaw thrust, my hand should, where's the OPA? You know, I just did a modified jaw thrust. Why don't I have an OPA in my hand? Because when I practice, the next thing I have is an OPA. It'll know, you'll miss it. You'll miss having it in your hand when it's supposed to be there if you practice that as a process. So I strongly encourage everyone, yes, practice the sub skill set, but don't neglect where it fits into the overall emergency action plan process. That's what has to be practiced on a regular basis.
All right, so we've been talking about airway management. We got Mike Cendoma and Kathy Schupak. All right, Kathy Schupak here, and so one of the things that you're talking about is using this airway management, using each of these individual skills as part of a bigger plan. I was also looking at, you have Team EMS Soft or EM Soft, so it's like the EMS Soft and kind of like a run-on word there. And one of the things there is like it creates an entire plan, so you can send it to the EMS and you can say, hey, this is where you guys are. This is the best entrance. You know, here's a Google map satellite picture of where I am and where I'm supposed to be. You know, and if I tell you I'm on field 1, then I have it, you know, labeled as field 1 so that they have that there for a quick reference and the best ways to enter there. Talk to me a little bit more about how using 2 minutes or less also integrates with the Team EM Soft.
Well, Team MSoft is that is a software application that grew out of In 2 Minutes or Less. Just by the nature of completing the In 2 Minutes or Less program, you're completing an emergency action plan. You're developing an emergency action plan, but there's so much more that goes into an emergency action plan. And what we found is, as we were working with various clients, particularly our professional colleagues, they have certain demands. And I think those demands are very similar across the athletic training spectrum. In the NFL, for example, they have a very specific criteria that their emergency action plans have to meet. Those teams have to develop the emergency action plan, and those emergency action plans have to be submitted to the league. So there's no way of getting around not having a good emergency action plan. Unfortunately, you go outside of the NFL and other professional sports, and emergency action plans really fall off in terms of the level of commitment to them. And I would never step on the field without an emergency action plan in place. That's just my nature. But I certainly understand how other athletic trainers might not be as dedicated to it, because it's very, very time consuming. It's very time consuming to write an emergency action plan. Once you have it in place, it's extremely time consuming to maintain and update and pass it out and do all of that. So MSoft is a platform where, I mean, as I had mentioned, since 1995, we've been teaching this program to multidisciplinary medical professionals all over the country. So we have a real good idea of what a good, solid emergency action plan looks like, and an emergency action plan that fits the bill for 98% of sports medicine professionals. So really all we did was take all of that information and boil it down and put it into some document templates that could be auto-filled and would very easily create comprehensive emergency action plans, but also very easily allow you to create venue-specific emergency action plans, sport-specific emergency action plans, in addition to conditional protocols. So we have a comprehensive emergency action plan, but we also have specific protocols for epinephrine auto-injectors, for glucose and diabetic emergencies, cold emergencies, heat emergencies. Those are kind of subsets of conditions in athletic training. But again, very hard if you are as an athletic trainer at a high school and somebody says to you, hey, we don't have a heat injury illness protocol. You need to write that up. Oh my gosh, in between everything else I have to do, now I have to go and do all the research in writing up a heat illness protocol for our school. It's very burdensome. So we've done all of that and put it into a platform, put it into a software application. And then the software application allows you to share that information with other individuals. So I had mentioned earlier on the medical timeout. Critical. The medical timeout is a critical component of any emergency action plan. And that's where we meet at the beginning of a game, prior to the start of a game. And I meet with the other athletic trainers, I meet with EMS, I meet with the team physicians from both sides, and we say, hey, if something happens, this is the way we're going to roll. So we provide a medical timeout, and we provide the ability to share your emergency action plan with incoming medical professionals so that you can enhance that medical timeout. Receiving facilities are an extremely important component of an emergency action plan that a lot of people overlook. If we have a respiratory distress or an airway management issue, what hospital in our area is most appropriate to receive that athlete? If we have a neurological injury, what hospital is most appropriate to receive that athlete? Your significant trauma and neurological injuries generally should go to your level 1 trauma center. Orthopedic injuries might be able to go to a different hospital, but we need to call those things out. We need to talk about those things prior to, and we need to share that information, because if you're coming to my facility to play on Friday night, you're coming from outside of the region. If we transport one of your athletes from our field, you have no idea where he went. You're relying completely on us to get you there to retrieve your athlete. If you're dad and I transport your son to our Strong Memorial Hospital, our level 1 trauma center, you have no idea where I just sent your son. All right. I can share that information with you instantaneously and give you turn-by-turn directions on how to go get your son or go be with your son, as well as communication and direct dial and hotline information to contact everybody that you need to. So that's just an application that grew out of all of the information that we process in the In 2 Minutes or Less program.
Have you seen any EMS services adapt or adopt, not adapt, your software and say, hey, for us, it's Acadian. Is it Acadian? Yeah. So it's Acadian for us. And have they said, okay, this is how we're best going to serve Pasadena ISD. Let's get this so that we're all on the same page. Have you seen any places like that do that?
Well, it's directed more for the athletic trainers. So what happens is your EMS organization gets it by default. So if your high school had Team MSoft, in your emergency action plan personnel would be your EMS coordinator. So your EMS coordinator would be added to the system. Your EMS coordinator would then come in and complete their component of the emergency action plan. So who's the EMS coordinator? What level of service is going to be provided? What's the contact's name? And then you as a group review the comprehensive document, and that comprehensive document is an educational opportunity for you to decide, okay, here's our facility. As the EMS coordinator, you tell me where is the best place for the ambulance to come in? What's the most appropriate rendezvous location for the EMS escort? What's the nearest intersection where you're going to enter the campus? And those are all things that you decide pre-event, pre-season. And then then your certain, the head athletic trainer has a certain amount of information that he plugs into the system, into what we call the team profile. EMS coordinator has his section. He completes his section of the team profile. And therefore, no one is really doing a whole lot of work. Everybody is just kind of plugging in the data for their information, but then the net result is a very comprehensive document and a very comprehensive approach. So by default, they wouldn't necessarily buy the software. They would have it by default because the team that is using it, or the school that is using it to develop a comprehensive emergency action plan that involves EMS. So it's a team. That's why it's a team approach to this.
I gotcha. Very good. Kathy, you have any more questions?
Nope.
Mike, you have any more big take-home points that people need to know about airway management, or that being part of an overall complete team approach to managing emergency situations?
I would just say that my biggest concern, as I said at the outset, my biggest concern is that when I step on the field and I look across and I see athletic trainers are easy to pick out. We're an easy crowd. We're easy to pick out of a crowd. You see the person carrying the Mueller kit and the defibrillator strapped over the other side. Instantaneously, you know who the athletic trainer is. So I want to know that by default, our profession is providing such a high level of care that when I go over and I introduce myself to that other athletic trainer, that by default, because we're athletic trainers, we are the absolute best people to have on that field to make the safest environment possible. And I get very frustrated when I go over and I talk to other opposing athletic trainers, and I realize that they have a kit with end rolls of tape flying out of it all over the place and things just thrown into it. Maybe they have a defibrillator, maybe they don't, but even if they do, it's obvious that it's going to be a nightmare situation if they have to deploy that thing. That's very, very frustrating. And I would say that as a profession, by default, we need to have that higher standard of order. If we're going to live up to the brag that we promote our profession, then that has to happen. The other thing I would say is, just if you're new to the profession or if you've never had an accident happen, your time is coming. If you spend any time in this profession, you will be confronted with one of these events. And if you're not ready for it, it will haunt you forever that you weren't ready to handle this. Even if you are ready to handle it, it'll haunt you to some degree. I know for myself, I thought athletic training was the greatest profession ever to be in. I still do. But the day that the event happened for me, my role as an athletic trainer took on a whole nother perspective. It wasn't just, this is a really cool profession. Look what I get to do for a living. I get to be around athletes, athletic events, and I get paid to do it. When an event like this happens, you realize what the true nature of our profession is. ACL injuries, ankle injuries, cuts, bruises, taping ankles, that's fine. That's all great and dandy. But if you're not prepared for these worst case events, you should not be on the field. You should not be calling yourself an athletic trainer. I fully believe in that. And what it takes to go that extra mile, as we talked about before, it's not that much. $100 worth of equipment and a little bit of training on the side to refresh on how to use those basic life support airway adjuncts, and look at what you've done in terms of the care that you can provide, and look at what you've done in terms of reducing the risk that something as simple as the tongue falling back over an airway because someone is unconscious. Look at what you've done in terms of reducing the risk that event turns into an actual medical emergency. That just goes from, it was just another thing that happened. It goes from that to being a medical emergency in a drop of a hat, just because you didn't have those simple things there that are routinely and readily available to you. So that would be my take-home point is, if you've had this happen, you and I are on the same page, and you know that the sidelines are a little bit more anxious for you on the sideline. If you haven't had it happen, realize that you need to have these things in place. You need to practice, and remember that no matter how much you practice, you're never going to be ready for the event when it happens. But this is the best that you can do, and you hope that you have that skill set that will carry you through. And it's only the practice that'll allow you to have that confidence to do that. So that would be my drive take-home message.
All right, Mike, in just a minute, it is National Athletic Training Month, and we're recording this. I'm going to ask you to thank an athletic trainer who has been beneficial to you. Kathy, I'm going to ask you to do the same. All right, so while they're thinking and preparing their thoughts, I want to also say that in our conversation with Perry Dennehy, as we were talking about our red emergency bag, the ones that I bought were from Stat Packs. They're really cool. They make the AED right on the outside. It's really obvious. We also mentioned going to EMS and saying, hey, this is my bag. What do you think about what I've packed in here? And they may say, hey, here's some OPAs. Here's some NPAs you can toss in. Here's this that, you might have. Here's a tourniquet that you can throw in there. That way, if you need it, you have it. They might. I actually emailed our EMS guy, which I have a pretty good relationship with because he helps out with our CPR training here. And I said, hey, Jason, I'm trying to put this together, but once I get all my stuff in, I'm going to bring it over to you. And he said, sounds good. Right. And so that's another option. And maybe that cuts your $100 investment down into a $50 investment or something like that.
Right.
I'm not guaranteed that they will, but at least getting that second opinion on your bag and having that stuff ready. And also they practice using that stuff. So maybe I go to my health science class and say, hey, do you guys have a mannequin that you practice this stuff with? Because they have a little bit more advanced mannequins than we do. Or maybe I go to my EMS people and say, hey, do you have something I can practice this with? Can you stand right beside me and help me walk through all of this process. And so you don't have to create everything. Just as you're building that relationship with EMS, working on that team approach, just go over there and say, hey, can you train me on this? Can you help me on this? And then go from there. Obviously, like Kathy said, if you got the opportunity to go see Mike doing the 2 minutes or less, then definitely take advantage of that opportunity. So Mike, an athletic trainer you would like to thank or give a shout out to?
Yeah, I have two, actually, if I could take the time to do that.
Sure.
First of all, way back when I was in undergraduate school, Pete Koenigke from Canisius College, he wasn't, he had, Canisius College had a formal program. I was at the University of Buffalo. University of Buffalo didn't have a formal program. Pete was kind enough to allow me to cross-register from UB to Canisius and actually take the athletic training classes that I needed in order to put my internship program together. So I'm always very, very thankful of that. Had he not been willing to do that, things would have been a little bit more challenging for me. I also want to thank Pete because all of us that are in the club that had to go through athletic training with Pete know how demanding he was as a clinical instructor. We can tell you stories all day long about that, but what's really interesting is, as far as the preparedness goes, I'm very thankful for him for providing that. But I'm also thankful because now I've been out as an athletic trainer for a number of years now, and I see Pete on occasion at the National Athletic Trainers meetings and those types of things. And he's gone from somebody that I was deathly afraid of as a student to someone who now I see as a very compassionate person. He's very sweet and he's very kind when he sees my wife. I'm just very thankful for the ability to get to know him and see him across that spectrum. And I'm thankful for his willingness to allow me to cross-register and get started on this. I'd also like to thank Rick Burkholder. He's now the head athletic trainer with the Kansas City Chiefs. When I first got to know Rick, he was with the Philadelphia Eagles. And at that time, I'm pretty sure I turned that off, but it's ringing on. At that time, Rick was instrumental. We did a program, I think it was in 2010, at the Professional Football Athletic Trainers winter meeting. And he was instrumental in getting my team the opportunity to do a presentation for that winter meeting. And it was from that winter meeting that our relationship with the NFL grew and with the PFATS organization grew to the point now where we provide programming for more than half of the league. And it was through that really in the last 8 to 10 years, the knowledge that has come about with that relationship with that organization has led to a lot of the advancements in the In 2 Minutes or Less program. So I'm very glad that I was able to meet with Rick and that Rick provided me that opportunity. So I'm very thankful for him for that.
All right, Rick, Pete, thanks for shaping Mike into the man that he is and the life changer that he is, because he's really helping shape athletic training and change who we are and what we do and improving the profession, the way we take care of our athletes. Kathy, wait, before you go though, I want to say thank you. Like, since you joined our district, there's been a lot of things that have happened. You've made a lot of changes. You've gone to this training. You said, hey, any way I can help. You've been part of the podcast. And so actually my AT shout out is going to be to you. Okay. So Kathy, thank you. Thank you for helping make changes, bringing us, kind of rubbing some edges and making things happen. Some people were like, I don't really like the way she does stuff, but it's because we've always done the same thing and we needed to elevate the level of care that we provide here. So thank you for being part of Pasadena ISD. Thank you for encouraging me and also encouraging us as a staff, as a team to improve and get better. Now it's your turn.
Thank you. I appreciate that. First, I'd like to thank Kim Farrell Mosley. She was probably the first female athletic trainer that was a mentor to me back at Texas State, Southwest Texas. There were very few female athletic trainers. She was a assistant there, and she gave me very great words of wisdom. She went on to. She was married to an athletic trainer, and her husband is with the Tennessee Titans. She has served in the WNBA and now is the head women's athletic trainer for women's basketball at Vanderbilt. But we've stayed in touch, and it was nice to have a role model who I could count on and bounce ideas off of, during the time when women were getting into this profession and, getting married and having children. And that was very important for me to have somebody who'd gone before me in that. So shout out to Kim and what a great profession she's had, and her husband, and they've raised 2 wonderful children. The other is to one of my former colleagues, also from college, but he's retiring this year, and that's Ted Perry at South Grand Prairie High School. Ted is one of those that doesn't like the limelight, but pardon me, he was a great help to me when I was in school, and has taken care of thousands of athletes in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I wish him well in his retirement, and I've learned a great deal from him. And if I ever had a question, I could call Ted up, and always had encouragement, and he usually had an answer for me. So good luck in your retirement, Ted.
All right, very good. Mike Cendoma, Sports Medicine Concepts, Airway Management, Team EM Soft, a holistic approach to preparing for an emergency. Practice, practice, practice. Again, you can Google Sports Medicine Concepts, sportsmedicineconcept.com. You can YouTube Sports Medicine Concepts, or again, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com. So I'll have links there. This one is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/airway management. And I've got links, ways to contact Mike and Kathy there. And again, if it's easier to look on my site or Google or Sports Medicine Concepts, whatever it is, do something to improve your emergency preparedness, and don't wait until something happens and look back and have that regret. Again, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/airway management. Mike, it was a pleasure to meet you. Kathy, always a pleasure to have you here. So for Jeremy, Mike, Kathy, that is a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a great opportunity. Thank you.